Tales from the Old Forest. Written and read for you by Jon Buckeridge. Chapter 10. Planting a Seed. Plentyn woke slowly. The sounds of the forest had switched from night to day. The owls replaced by songbirds, the crickets replaced by woodpeckers, the raccoons and bats by squirrels and lemurs. The storm they'd heard had indeed passed them by as they'd expected, but the whole forest seemed richer and more alert and alive for the rain that had refreshed it. He moved gently, trying not to dislodge the last vestiges of memory from the dream he'd been luxuriating in. As ever, as soon as he tried to focus on it, it began drifting away like hugging smoke. He had a vague, indistinct impression of a big family meal, not just him and his parents. There were other people too, older people. Uncles, aunties, grandparents maybe. As was often the case with these half-memories, he couldn't really see the faces of the people in them. Oh, they had faces, he was sure of that. But it was like he only ever caught the detail of them out of the corner of his eye, never quite in focus. Bizarrely, what he could remember very clearly was what he'd been eating at the time, an absolutely fantastic pumpkin pie. It was soft and light, with a crisp, buttery pastry and just the right amount of nutmeg and cinnamon. "Must have been late autumn," said Grandma when he told her about the memory over breakfast. "How do you know?" asked Plentyn. "Pumpkins, lad," she replied, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "If you got pumpkins and you're looking at late autumn, early winter, sometime in November if I were to hazard a guess." "It could have been frozen," Plentyn replied. "That it could," Grandma nodded, "though personally I don't hold with such notions, and I'll say if this pie was truly as good as you remember, then it's more than likely fresh as a daisy. They always taste better." Plentyn nodded in agreement. Having lived on Grandma's always fresh cooking for the last however long, he'd learned a lot about the benefits of eating seasonally. "It's a bit strange, though," he ventured. "There I was all that while, surrounded by family and people who loved me, but the thing I chose to remember is a pie." He felt a sudden flash of guilt. "Does that make me a horrible person?" he asked. Grandma dismissed the notion emphatically. "Does it make you a horrible person? No, of course not. You remembered what you remembered, and it must have felt important to you at the time. Now what we have to ask ourselves is, why was it so important to you, "It did taste pretty spectacular," Plentyn said. He looked down at Red, her face currently enveloped in a pile of nuts and berries. Clearly the little squirrel was rubbing off on him if all he thought of was food. "You don't remember the things you don't think you'll lose," chimed in Hopper from across the circle. At this, Grandma's face lit up. She clapped her hands in agreement and pointed at Hopper enthusiastically. "Well said, Master Roo," she crowed. "I'm not sure I follow," said Plentyn. "Think about it, mate," said Hopper. If you'd even suspected that this might be the last time you saw your family, you'd have drunk in every memory you could and bottled it up tight, right?" His tone was earnest and honest, and Plentyn could tell it came from a wealth of personal experience. "Right," he agreed, nodding. "But your brain told you that this pie was the moment to recall, which tells me that happy family memories were something you experienced all the time." Plentyn sat back a moment, rocked by this logic. "What a wonderful world," Grandma said softly, "where you had a home so full of love that your young brain was able to take that as read and remember a pie." Again, Plentyn was bowled over by the truth of this. He certainly hoped it was true. "Besides," Grandma went on, "maybe the pie is all the more special because of who made it." A spark seemed to flash to life in Plentyn's brain as this was mentioned. A series of pictures flickered across his memory. Plentyn's father cutting open the top of the pumpkin, Plentyn and his mother scooping out the insides, the three of them rolling out pastry together, his mother bringing a hot steaming pie out of the oven while the rest of the family applauded. "I did," gasped Plentyn as the vignette of memories rolled across his mind's eye. "At least, I helped," he qualified, "but Mum and Dad kept telling everyone that I'd made it." "There you go then," said Grandma. "All makes sense as makes no matter." This was one of her many slightly odd phrases Plentyn could never quite work out the meaning of, and he mentally referred to them as grandma-isms. "That sounds like a pretty great reason to remember a pie, mate," said Hopper. "What is pie?" asked Red, emerging from her breakfast. As Plentyn and Grandma explained it between them, the squirrel's eyes went wide. "Pie is good. You make pie," she instructed, not letting up until she'd extracted solemn promises from both Plentyn and Grandma that there would in fact be pie in her near future. "So, where are we heading today?" Plentyn asked Grandma, feeling they'd discussed dessert foods for quite long enough. To his surprise, though, it was Maximus who answered. "I must go," he sent shortly. "I return to Mousekind." There was a silence around the circle. Plentyn felt shocked. He'd grown used to the small, silent figure and was quite unready to be parted from him. "Are you sure?" he asked Maximus. "Couldn't we convince you to stay a bit more?" But Maximus was resolute. "I was to take you to Lyons. We went to Lyons. I must go." Plentyn, Red, and Hopper tried to protest, but to no avail. Maximus's mind was made up. Plentyn was crestfallen. He'd been enjoying their adventure so much. The thought of it coming to an end was truly heartbreaking. He scanned the group, looking for some sign of hope from the rest of the party. And that was when he noticed Hopper's ears twitch slightly, and his soulful eyes looked away for a moment. "Oh no, not you as well?" he asked in a small voice, already knowing the answer. Around them, the forest was soft and calm, with the sound of birds and creatures about their business. But in Plentyn's ears, a strange, pulsing, rushing sound had begun to build. "I'll come with you as far as we take Maximus, mate," sent the kangaroo. "But after that," he trailed off, looking down. The rushing sound in Plentyn's ears grew louder. He felt a slow, horrible, creeping flush of anger rising up inside him. He didn't want it to happen, but he didn't feel like he could stop it either. One friend departing from the group he could have dealt with, but two? It all felt like too much. The ice-hot shard of emotion burned within him. "I'm sorry, mate," sent Hopper, seeing Plentyn's reaction. He wasn't talking, so he couldn't sigh, but he seemed to do the mental equivalent. "It's about time I head back to the bush and track down my mob, I reckon. I've been away too long." "I don't need your excuses," Plentyn snapped. The sound in his ears was like a ringing now, all the calm sounds of the forest drowned out. "Plentyn, really?" Hopper began. "It's fine," he barked. "It's all fine. You can leave, and Maximus can leave, and I'll be fine. I've been on my own before, and I can be on my own again." He stopped, mid-sentence, mid-word, mid-thought. There was something here, something behind the anger, something small and ugly and scared. In the dark recesses of his mind, the really shadowed and gloomy corners, it was like Plentyn held a torch and shone it on a part that he'd never seen lit before. Where he'd imagined huge, rage-filled monsters, all teeth and claws, there was just fear. He was afraid. Afraid of being on his own again. Afraid of turning back into that small, terrified boy running through the trees, running for his life, running without his parents. Instantly, the anger was gone. Now he'd seen it, really seen it. Now he'd stared it in the face and saw what it truly was. It seemed hollow and empty. He turned back to Hopper. "I'm sorry," he said in a small voice. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I think I was just scared. It's just, I've not really parted ways with someone without it being..." He trailed off, still not wanting to look too closely at that thought. Hopper's eyes widened, though, as he took in Plentyn's meaning. "This isn't that, mate," he confirmed, reassurance carved into every word. "I am so sorry to say goodbye to you, but I think I'm needed back with the mob. They're all struggling just as much as me, and they could use my help getting things back together." The ringing and rushing in Plentyn's ears was dying down now, and he could begin to hear the sounds of the forest again. He thought of the joy Hopper had shown at being back on the plains the day before. He thought of how he'd spoken about his mob, and how devastated they'd been by the illness amongst them, and it all made sense. He felt tears prick his eyes as Hopper's forepaw found his shoulder.
"Of course they need you," said Plentyn, nodding his head. "It's where you need to be. It makes perfect sense, really. I'm just sorry to see you go, is all."
"It's not forever," sent Hopper. "You think I'm done being mates with a ripper guy like you? Not a chance." He shook his head from side to side vigorously, forcing Maximus to fasten his grip hurriedly. "You and me have got heaps of adventures ahead of us." Plentyn nodded, trying to blink back the tears.
"I know," he agreed. I really do."
"I promise I'll come see you in the forest if you come find me on the plains," Hopper challenged.
"Deal," Plentyn agreed, grinning through his tears. "I'll hold you to it."
"And so will I," chimed in Grandma. There was a slight tone to her voice that told Plentyn she really meant it, which, in the old forest, practically meant it was law. "Come on now, you lot," she said gently. "We've a fair way to trek before we deliver our mouse envoy safely back home and send Master Roo off in search of his." In a short while, they'd packed up their camp and were on their way. Grandma was out in the lead, so Plentyn had a while to walk with Hopper, Maximus and Red. They didn't feel the need to speak much, just enjoying each other's company and listening to the vibrant bustle of the forest creatures. And Plentyn reflected on how Hopper had told him that sometimes the best act of kindness was just walking alongside someone.
"I'm glad that, after spending some time away from your mob, you finally feel ready to go back to them," he said to Hopper, and despite his sadness at their parting, he found he really meant it.
"Me too," Hopper replied. "I think being with a great bunch like you lot reminded me how much I need to be around folks, you know? I don't know what it's like for mice and squirrels." He glanced at Red and flicked his eyes up towards Maximus. "But we Roos are definitely social animals, not so great on our own." Plentyn nodded in understanding, grateful they'd been able to play a small part in Hopper's rediscovery of his need for family. He put on his best grandma voice and brought out the grandmaism she'd used earlier that day. "All makes sense as makes no matter." He'd not quite expected them to fall about laughing, but he'd worked hard on his grandma voice, and he at least hoped for a chuckle, or even a grudging smile. Instead, they looked at him confused.
"What's this?"
Maximus asked. "Who was that supposed to be, mate?" asked Hopper. "Is that how you hear me?" "No," Plentyn replied, slightly abashed. He thought his impression of Grandma was pretty spot on up to now. He tried the voice again. "It's me, Grandma," he blurted, then remembered that wasn't the name they used. "Kalineki and Marzimilia."
"This not how she sounds," sent Maximus.
"Are you joking?" asked Plentyn, feeling slightly defensive now. "I know it's not perfect, but it's pretty close." "Nah, mate, no joke. That's not how she sounds," confirmed Hopper. "What?" asked Plentyn, confused now. "So, what does she sound like then?"
Like me,"
sent Hopper, Maximus and Red all at once. There was an awkward moment of silence while all four of them looked at each other. Then Plentyn clarified. "So, are you three saying you all hear her sounding like you?" he asked. "Well, not exactly like me," Hopper clarified, "but like she might have been raised in the neighbouring mob, if you know what I mean."
"Same,"
confirmed Red.
"Is also same,"
agreed Maximus. There was another long silence. "So," Plentyn began after a moment of contemplation, "we all hear her in a voice that sounds like us?" he asked. But then he clarified. "Well, she doesn't really sound like me, but she sounds like... Well, she sounds comforting and warm and kind, and she sounds just like we need her to sound," Hopper finished. They all paced on in silence a while longer as the gravity of this set in. A thought occurred to him. "Wait, so how does she look to you?" he asked, suddenly worried she might appear differently to each of them. Was Hopper seeing her as a kangaroo? Did Red see a giant squirrel? He described the figure he knew as Grandma. "Yep," agreed Hopper when he'd finished. "That's pretty much what I see too." And Red and Maximus were quick to agree. Plentyn felt a little relieved at that confirmation, though still unsettled by the idea that what he had believed to be a universal truth was in fact different for each person. He reflected on what Jabari had told him about different people seeing different things in the same objects and stories, and that Grandma wasn't someone who could be captured by the labels put on her. He thought about how he'd needed a grandma, and so that's what she became to him. Clearly Hopper had needed someone to point him to family, so that's what she was to him.
He wondered what Red and Maximus had needed. Perhaps it was all just another way she showed kindness and generosity to those around her. He would have liked to discuss it further, but at that moment he looked up to realize they'd arrived back at the tree where all mousekind would be waiting. Here was where Maximus and Hopper would leave them. As before, when they reached the hollow trunk, there was that moment of ceremony, where Grandma announced herself with all the old names and titles by which the mouse people knew her, and the hidden doors parted. This time, though, Plentyn idly wondered what voice and tone the mice heard the words in. Weird, he thought. I wonder if each of them hears it very slightly differently. Mercifully, they were not expected to head into the long, dark tunnel again, as Dedushka came to greet them. "Welcome back, my fine friends," the old mouse sent warmly, "and thank you for returning our noble warrior intact." "He was very brave," said Plentyn, thinking about how Maximus had been his example around the lions, and feeling the need to confirm to Dedushka that Maximus had represented mousekind well. From his place between Hopper's ears, Maximus gave a nod of thanks. Dedushka looked at the small mouse with a sparkle in his eye. "I would expect nothing less," he sent, practically glowing with pride. With that, the group descended into that time of busy milling around and final snatches of conversation that always precede an inevitable parting, and Plentyn found himself left alone with Dedushka. Now that he knew who the mouse was, and knew what the mouse was, he saw far more in the tiny figure than he'd known to look for in the past. Dedushka was small, of course he was a mouse, but he didn't feel small. There was a sense of largeness about him, Plentyn decided, and of power. Not power in the sense of strength or fierceness, but there was some feeling that Dedushka could be connected deeply to the very roots of the earth, like he knew things going back to the dawn of time, and Plentyn realized he'd only ever known that in one other person, Grandma herself. Perhaps here he might gain some wisdom. "Dedushka," he asked the mouse, "we've noticed that Grandma, Mat Vermilia as you call her, is a bit different." He trailed off, not quite sure how to phrase the question. Dedushka seemed to understand, though. "She is what you might call unique," he confirmed. "Never have I met a soul who is so many things to so many creatures and yet so completely herself." Plentyn chewed that sentence over for a second and began to see the sense in it. Grandma definitely seemed to be known by all the animal kingdoms. Each had their own name for her, each heard her in their own voice. But those were just things she let them do. More of a politeness than anything else. They didn't define anything about her. She may have given those around her names that she would answer to, but she was, right to her core, her own. "I think that makes sense," he told Dedushka. "Like, I still need, a grandma to look after me, so that's how she presented herself. But it doesn't make her my grandma."
"Precisely," Dedushka agreed. "For me, I am different. I have one purpose. I am the voice and memory of my people."
He gestured to the dark passageway still looming behind them.
"I must serve this purpose. I can serve no other purpose. Do you follow me, Plentyn, friend of Matzimilia?"
"I follow you," said Plentyn, nodding enthusiastically.
"So it is with all of my kind. We both lead and serve our people. She, however, she leads no one but herself. She serves no one but herself. Do not mistake my meaning. I do not imply that she is selfish, but that she will serve others only when it seems right and proper for her to do so for the good of all."
Again, Plentyn nodded. This tallied with what he knew of Grandma.
"So, if she has chosen to serve you as a grandma may serve a child, knowing this is of her own will and entirely without obligation, then we must conclude that she sees great worth and value and goodness in you, which she would like to nurture."
Plentyn was dumbstruck at this notion. He'd always assumed Grandma was just being kind to a poor, lost boy. He'd never stopped to consider that she may be doing more, that she saw in him something that was important and valuable. Dedushka's black eyes crinkled in a smile as he saw the realization settle on him.
I, for one, look forward to seeing what fruit her nurturing may produce, and what you might become in the years to follow."
He glanced up behind Plentyn, seeing Hopper was ready to make his way towards the plains the kangaroos called home and find his mob.
"But now I think you have business to attend to which I will not hold you back from. Farewell, Plentyn, friend of Maximilia. You are always welcome in the halls of Mousekind."
With that began the sad process of parting between the 5 companions. I shall spare you most of the sad details, but will tell you that everyone embraced as best as their size differences would allow, and many tears were shed, except for Maximus, who bore it all with his trademark stoicism. Though they hadn't been together long, the journey had felt eventful, especially for Plentyn, and he felt like he'd lived a lifetime in their company. Stealing one last hug, Plentyn let Hopper go, and watched him bounding off along the path towards the plains. Then, after a final word of parting to Maximus and Dedushka, the secret doors to Mousekind shut, and Plentyn, Grandma, and Red were left alone. Despite the fact there were still 3 of them, they felt somehow diminished and lonely without their other 2 companions. "You're not leaving us too, are you, Red?" Plentyn asked his friend sadly.
"No," she replied emphatically. "You promised pie."
Plentyn laughed, and Grandma chuckled as she led them on their way home. "Come on, you 2, the old woman barked. "We've some good miles to cover before we can bed down for the night." And she took the lead. A day later, the 3 of them arrived back at Grandma's home in the strangely grown tree. Despite being sad their adventure had come to an end, Plentyn felt a wonderful sense of comfort and relief at their homecoming. They trudged up the steps that wound around the great tree's trunk wearily and made their way into the cabin Plentyn had come to call home. Grandma made to light a fire and put their old cast-iron kettle on to boil, but Plentyn beat her to it, instructing her to relax for a while. "Well, aren't you kind?" Grandma said, "and I shall not say no to that with the ache in my weary old bones." Plentyn grinned to himself. Though she liked to play the part of a withered old crone, he suspected this was just another one of the many ways that she made others comfortable in her presence, and age held no more sway over her than anything else. Following Jabari's advice, though, he had decided not to keep pressing her for those parts of her personality she didn't reveal to him, and instead be grateful for those that she did. To Plentyn she was Grandma, and that was more than enough for him. "So," she asked him when they both had steaming cups of tea in their hands, "what did you learn on our little adventure then, lad?" Her purple-green eyes sparkled at him over the rim of her cup as she took a sip, and Plentyn thought carefully about his answer. "Well," he began after a moment of contemplation, "I learned a lot about kangaroos and mice and lions and squirrels," interrupted Red from a corner where she was snacking happily on some fruit. "And squirrels," Plentyn confirmed. "And I learned a great deal about kindness. And I began to remember more about my parents." This wasn't news to Grandma. He'd taken every opportunity to discuss each reclaimed memory with her, but somehow saying it out loud like this made it seem more official and real. Grandma nodded sagely, making no comment. "I don't remember it all yet. In fact, I don't remember much yet. But I feel like I'm starting to. Like I've taken the first step on a path I've not discovered yet." He thought about that a moment longer and corrected himself. "No, that's not quite right. I feel like I've taken the first steps on a path I used to know, but I haven't walked in ages. And every now and then, I see a bit that seems familiar. Does that make sense?" Grandma's eyes were gleaming now, and Plentyn was surprised to see there were tears welling up in them. "That makes perfect sense to me, lad," she said, her voice slightly croaky with emotion. "Goodness, but you've been forced to grow up quick in so many ways, and not many of them good. It's nice to see you rediscovering those parts of you that you were forced to leave behind." They were silent for a moment, the only sounds the whispering of their fire, the contented munching of Red, and the sounds of the forest as dusk fell upon it. "So, what did you learn, Grandma?" Plentyn asked her, breaking the silence between them. The old woman looked momentarily taken aback, like the tables had been unexpectedly turned on her. She tilted her head to the side in consideration, her eyes following the path of a darting bat now flitting around outside. Eventually she spoke. Do you know, I've been bimbling around these trees for, longer than they have words to describe, and it's often tempting to think there are no more lessons to learn. But what I actually think is that as you get older, you start relearning the really important lessons all over again. She turned her purple-green eyes on him warmly. You remember the lessons you learned about kindness on this journey? How you can't show it when you're looking only at yourself? How kindness requires action? How even a small act has value? Plentyn nodded and Grandma went on. Well, I relearned that kindness is like a seed, you see. And the thing about seeds is that when you plant one, it goes on to produce more. And those go on to produce more, and those go on to produce more, and so on forever and a day. She looked out of one of the windows at the old forest around them, now shadowed in the deep blue light of dusk. This whole forest was birthed by tiny seeds once upon a time, and yet look at the life and growth and magic that comes out of them. Imagine what would happen if you planted more seeds of kindness in those around you, and they gave them on to the next, and they gave them on to the next. Why, can you imagine the forest that we'd grow then? She looked back at him again, and this time it was his turn to have tears in his eyes. He rushed up to Grandma and hugged her tightly. Just as in the Pride Lands, she was ready with a masterful hug with no warning required. Just as in the Pride Lands, no words were required either. They rocked back and forth for a little while longer, and eventually Grandma broke the silence. Now, off to bed with you, lad, she said, a slightly mischievous sparkle coming to her eyes. This little adventure's come to a close, but tomorrow, well, tomorrow will hold adventures all of its own. And so we'll leave them there, I think, in their magnificent house among the trees, one adventure behind them and so many ahead. To my sure and certain knowledge, Plentyn, Grandma, Hopper, Red and Maximus are all still there, journeying, discovering and adventuring around the old forest together. And the stories of those adventures? Well, you'll just have to wait and see.
Thanks for listening. Tales from the Old Forest was a Settle Stories commission. Written and read for you by Jon Buckeridge. Story editor was Miriam Sarin. Intro music was Adventure is Calling by Vens Adams. Outro music was Conquest of Paradise by Simon Folwar. It was a Parable Arts production.